thank you everybody for coming out and coming down here to the depths of the hotel, right next to the boiler room, the usual home of traditional jazz. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce to all 6 of you, as well as the throngs of people watching online, two people that I've known for quite a while. We have Bill Dendle, who is the head of the Tea Garden Jazz Camp in Northern California, and who was there when I first started playing traditional jazz, when I directs, among many other things, the Capitol Focus traditional jazz band out of Washington, D.C., and he also has set up the traditional jazz education curriculum that has been distributed by Jen and the Smithsonian Institute, among many other things, and they're here to talk to us today about how traditional jazz informs contemporary performances. And without any further ado, please keep your masks on if you're not eating or whatever, and let's begin.
Thank you.
Well done, Duncan. Thank you very much. It's good to see you, as always.
You too.
Yay. Very few of the presiders get applause. Did you know that? So I think, Duncan, you stood out in that regard. All right, I have my mask off so that I speak into the microphone, because if I don't, my voice will get too tired, because I've been using too much warming up for what we're going to do. I would like to first inquire of the 4 people that I don't know who are here, what attracted you to this session? Why did you want to see this? It's warm.
What is this?
No, what brought you in here? What are you hoping to learn or hear about?
From what the schedule says, this is like a Latin improvisation sort of clinic.
No.
No, you're in the wrong place.
I'm in the wrong place. What's that?
You're welcome to stay.
Okay. But anyway, what we're going to be talking about, I'm Bill, he's Dave, and our purpose here today is to convince you of 2 things. The first one is that traditional jazz is a contemporary form of jazz. It's not some old relic. It's not something that happened before real jazz began. It's a living, breathing, and constantly present art form, and an important part of American music. It's still here. The other thing we want to convince you of is that traditional jazz should be taught more comprehensively in jazz education programs for a number of different reasons that we will address as we go further along. It's important, for starters, to define some terms, and there's nobody better than Dave Robinson to do that, because he knows this stuff inside out. Nobody in the history of music has put more time and effort into understanding and looking at and appreciating traditional jazz in all its different forms. So Mr. Dave Robinson will tell you what traditional jazz is, among other things. You're on, Dave.
All right, thank you, Bill. Thanks for being here. And yeah, so this session is, our topic is the sort of traditional jazz can be modern. And we mean 2 things by that. One is, there is a modern, so-called modern jazz approach to traditional jazz, which sounds contradictory, but we'll explore that. The other is the sense that traditional jazz is still relevant to our modern times. As Bill said, it's not a relic of the past. So those are the 2 aspects of what we mean by traditional jazz is modern. So we're going to play you some examples of that and talk about that. But first we have to say, what is traditional jazz? So Bill has tossed me that task. So my definition of traditional jazz is found in the traditional jazz curriculum kit that I produced with grant assistance through the auspices of Jen, and it's available for free to educators. and it guides you through various lessons in how to help your students approach this music. And so as part of that, there's a teacher's guide, and I've put in there an attempt to define what traditional jazz is, what we mean when we say traditional jazz. So here's my attempt. It's an approach to jazz performance that exhibits all or most of the following characteristics. First of all, and most importantly, the wind instruments are playing polyphonically. So you've got generally 2 to 4 horns as what's called a front line, and at some point, usually at the beginning and at the end of the performance, they are improvising together, and they're weaving counterpoints, listening to each other and trying to make a cohesive statement with everybody improvising in a way that doesn't sound like everybody's soloing at once, but functioning as an ensemble. That's one characteristic. Another characteristic is an easily discernible chord pattern. So in very contemporary jazz, the chord pattern gets more challenging and difficult for the average listener to follow. That's not a value judgment. That doesn't mean it's better, doesn't mean it's worse, but it is more challenging to follow. In traditional jazz, it stems from an earlier time, and the chord sequences are more accessible to the average ear. Let's just put it that way. Traditional jazz generally follows a 2/4 or 4/4 meter. So contemporary jazz, you'll often encounter 5/4 time, 7/8 time, this kind of thing. You'll seldom encounter that in traditional jazz. Once in a blue moon, you'll encounter a traditional jazz treatment of a waltz in 3/4 time, but rarely. It's almost all 2/4 or 4/4 meter. Fourth characteristic is the instrumentation, which I alluded to just briefly a minute ago. So normally you have what we call a front line. You've got a trumpet or a cornet, sometimes 2. You've got a clarinet, or sometimes a soprano sax. You've got a trombone, and sometimes you have an additional sax, which would generally be a tenor, but can sometimes be an alto, or a subset of those. And then they're playing against a rhythm section, which generally, but not always, has piano, either banjo or guitar. And playing the bass line, it could be a bass, an upright bass, or it could be a tuba, or it could be a bass saxophone. And then, of course, drums, or sometimes, instead of drums, washboard. So that's your trad jazz instrumentation. Generally something like trumpet, clarinet, trombone, piano, banjo or guitar, tuba or bass, and drums. That's the most standard instrumentation. And then the fifth thing is the use of what I'll call Prebob harmonies and phrasing. So it's the language of the swing era, or previous to the swing era in the 1920s. They're using this language generally. But because today's session is homing in on sort of the modern aspect of trad jazz, we're going to listen to examples where that fifth characteristic is not apparent. You're hearing bop or post-swing harmonies and phrasing, and yet it's still trad jazz because it has these other characteristics. So that's my attempt to sort of nail down what do we mean by trad jazz.
Okay, you ready for your first example?
Yes.
Would you like to introduce what we're going to be hearing?
Are we doing mine first?
Sure.
Oh, okay. Okay, so here's some examples. So again, 2 things we're trying to leave you with as far as modern and trad. Traditional jazz has an approach. Traditional jazz has a whole bunch of styles to it. One of those stylistic approaches uses modern phrasing, modern chord patterns. It's an exception to the general rule, but it is one approach to trad jazz, and we're going to hone in on that. And the other, again, is just that whether it uses that approach or not, any and all of these trad jazz styles are still relevant today, exciting today, and have limitless possibilities for self-expression and for you to find your own voice within the language and so forth. It's just as hip as anything else. All the styles of jazz are still relevant, hip, exciting, and worthwhile. That's my opinion. So, but here are some examples of how you can play traditional jazz and bring a modern sensibility to it, a modern jazz sensibility. Now, I kind of hate to use the word modern because it implies up to date. Like if it's not a modern jazz approach, then it's not up to date and it's no longer relevant. We don't want to put it that way. But these are examples of trad jazz that use modern jazz or contemporary jazz phrasing and harmonic possibilities and so forth.
I'd like to address that term modern because what it does really is it draws a line and says that anything that was before this
Yes.
is no longer relevant.
Right.
That's the opposite of modern would be old-fashioned, meaning not credible, not useful today. Untrue. And your first example is from 1954, I see?
Yeah, so here, this first started, this sort of melding of post-swing vocabulary with the traditional jazz instrumentation and format started first happening in the 1950s. So here's a few early examples of this. First one is from 1954. It's a group called The Six. It included Bob Wilbur on clarinet, Johnny Glazell on trumpet, Eddie Fife on drums, and other players that are sort of trying to bridge the gap between typical trad jazz. And by the way, trad jazz is the term today. Please don't call it Dixieland, okay? We're taking down Confederate statues, and we're also trying to lose the term Dixieland. So that's an outdated term, but it was in widespread use in the 50s. So you're going to encounter it a little bit during this presentation, but we don't use it as a term to describe the whole body of work of what's now called trad jazz or traditional jazz.
Okay, here's The Six, a traditional jazz band playing with a more modern sensibility.
This is Riverboat Shuffle from 1954, tune from the 20s. This is Bob Fraser right here, isn't it? Listen to this.
We almost slipped over into Dave Steinmeier there for a minute.
No. So there's a kind of an updated or modernized approach to Riverboat Shuffle. You still heard the polyphonic improvisation. It was a group with standard trad jazz instrumentation, playing a standard trad jazz tune, but bringing bop language into the picture. Okay? Doesn't make it better, doesn't make it worse, but it is an approach, and you can do that and still be playing trad jazz.
And at this point, I would interject that the notion that trad jazz existed in the 20s and 30s and then disappeared is just absolutely not true. It did take on elements from the swing era that individual players absorbed and used to express themselves. And when bebop came along, they started taking some of the more extended harmonies, the phrasing, the rhythmic structures, some other bits and pieces. And it kept growing. It never, obviously, it never became something else. It's always, and is still today, traditional jazz. There are a range of ways to play traditional jazz. Let me slip in here with a recording that I made. This is I'll do two quick ones. There was a really popular jazz band, trad jazz band in the 1950s. They sold millions of albums. They were the first band, jazz band to record in stereo. And they were very, very popular and vilified by critics, almost always and forever. It was a band called the Dukes of Dixieland. It was a couple of brothers and their dad. They were very popular in New Orleans. I found two recordings of the same song. This first one is from 1952. This is the Dukes of Dixieland in 1952. I'll just play part of it. Playing at the Jazz Band Ball, a traditional jazz standard that goes way back to Nick LaRocca and all those guys. That's the way they sounded in 1952. They recorded the same song 10 years later, and it sounds like this. Same band, more or less. That there after the first chorus. There's a significant difference in what's going on there, in particular with the trumpet. Frank Jacinto, the older of the two Centaur Brothers, really grew and really is sort of the poster child for incorporating more modern aspects of the music into what was still traditional jazz. So just in the period of 10 years. By the way, the guitarist, you couldn't hear him on that recording, was Herb Ellis, a name fairly well known from playing with Oscar Peterson and lots of other people. Anyway, I just wanted to interject that right there. Dave, you have another clip you want to get to?
Another one.
Another
clip. Sure, yeah.
One moment before you do. Sandy.
Could you just define when you mean maybe Prebob language? Just because, can something be defined by, how would you define that language?
It's hard to define, you have to listen to it. So, if you listen to Louis Armstrong's great Hot 5, Hot 7 recordings, and listen to the way he phrased, and listen to the way he phrased throughout his life, pretty much. He didn't, he changed some things stylistically, but his approach was always very much on the beat. And that kind of phrase. And then in the swing era, it sort of changed to more of a triplet feel. So if you think in terms of fast triplets, diddly 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 diddly, and then in the bop era, it became faster, and it became a little more straight eighth. Right?
Well, that's what.
I mean, that's an oversimplification, but
That's what Frank Centaur was doing in that second recording. The rhythm of his playing and the rhythm of the way he played the melody became more what Dave just described. Not as lyrical and emphasizing rhythm in a more regular way. That's the hardest thing in the world to do with jazz. Jazz is like love. Defining it is just almost impossible. It's the best way to define it is to listen to it and see what it engenders as an emotional response in yourself. Do you have another one you want to do? Or?
yeah. So you heard the way the clarinet was phrasing in my example. That was Bob Wilbur, who plays a wonderful swing, but he was playing in a Bob context. He was sounding more like a Buddy DeFranco right there. Right? He was from the.
Sir.
Well, I might add to this. The way I've described it to my students sometimes is vertical as opposed to horizontal.
Okay.
And, you know, the innovations of Lester Young started to find more horizontal melodies
Yeah.
that eventually you sort of define Bach a little more than the.
Yeah, instead of arpeggios.
Right, so that's
Or
that's
linear.
another way to kind of draw a distinction, I think, between bebop and early jazz.
Yeah. I think that the overall effect of the ensemble has a lot to do with defining whether something is to be considered bebopish or modern or whether traditional. It's less about the soloist, and it became that way over time. There was a period, I think primarily in the early 60s, there were a lot of studio musicians in LA involved in playing what was known as Dixieland traditional jazz. And the style became known as Dixie Bop because the ensembles were very traditional, the polyphonic approach, the typical instrumentation. But when you got into the solos, guys like Dick Cathcart, Don Goldie, really advanced instrumentalists, if you could say people with really superior technique, and they were able to bring in those elements into their solos without stepping over the lines. And of course, the rhythm section played a role in that because the rhythm section in general was affected a lot by swing. And the more modern, the more contemporary traditional jazz that we've been talking about is informed more by the swing ethic than by the bebop. But the bebop and the modern players did have an effect on the soloists, particularly trumpets, saxophones, clarinets. Yeah.
I was noticing with the examples you were playing, the drummers were playing four on the floor.
They are.
Swinger.
Yes, that's what I say, swinger
Yeah.
kind of playing. Let's move to something else because we're going to run out of time if we play all the recordings we brought. They're all good recordings and worthy of being heard. But there are some things that we wanted to emphasize because, as I said, for the people who came in later, our purpose is to do two things. We want to convince you that traditional jazz didn't go away as more modern forms evolved, that it stayed contemporary throughout its life and still is today. And the other is that it has value in the jazz curriculum, that having people learn or experience playing in this style is useful to them in any jazz context. And we'll invite some friends to talk about that in a moment. There's a couple of things I wanted to say. That there's a tendency among all critics of the arts to favor novelty. And they often seem to feel that earlier forms of an art are less than the contemporary forms. And I'm here to disagree with that. You may agree with it, I don't know, but it seems to me that older forms of art are looked down upon as though they haven't fully evolved. Dave and I have had this discussion many times. that modern jazz is not something that is an evolution of traditional jazz. It's a different approach to the same thing.
The best way I've ever heard that expressed was by you, Bill. When you once said to me, jazz didn't evolve, it expanded.
Well, that's
Think about
good.
that. That's a beautiful statement.
Well, thank you, Dave. I've been writing down thoughts for weeks, preparing to be here to talk with you. And I wrote this one down. The use of familiar techniques or conventions doesn't diminish the quality of what is created. Realistic painting of a rural scene evokes an emotional response or moves the viewer in some essential way, then it is art. The same is true of music. A simpler language, and let's introduce that term of language. When you go to play in a certain stylistic band, if you're playing in a bebop band, you use the language of bebop. If you're playing in a fusion band, you use the language of fusion. If you're playing in a traditional band, you use that. These are all individual languages. You can learn to speak many different languages and to be familiar with them. And the fact that the vocabulary differs does not diminish the art. Yes, the vocabulary in traditional jazz is in some ways simpler. The chords tend to be simpler. You know, you're not going to look at or listen to the opening chord of at the Darktown Strutters Ball, an old traditional song. The first chord of that song is C. It's not C 6 9 sharp 11. It's, you know, it's a simplified thing. And in that simplicity, you can still make a meaningful artistic musical statement without having to wander as far as you possibly can into the nether reaches of the chord extensions. I wish I had thought to bring some examples of people playing, but Louis Armstrong is one. It's their emotional artistic statement without wandering out into the galaxy to more extended harmonies. That being said, where is it? I wrote down all these notes for myself. Now I can't find them, of course. It's possible, if you think about language in general, language with words, it's possible to make a very profound statement using very simple language. In fact, sometimes it actually works better. If you can say something profound in simple language, it's more easily apprehended by other people. They can get the meaning of it more quickly. It's more direct. Does that mean that employing a grandiloquent vocabulary makes the statement? Yes, you need to eschew your predilection for obfuscatory persiflage. What you need to do, it's still, you can make an emotional statement, you can make a meaningful, profound statement using an extensive vocabulary or words that are not usual for most people to use, or you can do it simply. Both are valid. You can be more specific if you use, if you say, a more extensive vocabulary. That's the purpose of words, to be specific and to communicate meaning. Yes?
Yes, I just am curious how teaching traditional jazz to students, how that might enhance their learning of other styles of jazz.
Well, you know what? We have a couple of musicians that came by today, and I'd like to invite Duncan to speak to that because he has the experience. Duncan Mckelvin was a student at our jazz camp many years ago when he was just a child, and he drove his band director nuts. And the band director's here too, Bob Williams. from TNT,
Bob, can you verify that?
the traditional jazz band that the Sacramento Jazz Education Foundation sponsors. Duncan came to those rehearsals where they were playing trad jazz and wanted to play bebop all the time.
It was not that bad. It was not that bad.
Well, you should hear Bob talk about it. Do you want a microphone?
Oh, sure. That's a dangerous offer, but
Yes. Well, there's a time limit. It'll expire.
like you said, my name's Duncan Mckelvin, and he was there right when I first started to learn jazz, and I first started to learn jazz in a traditional jazz context. I did not learn the blues scale or a 2-5-1 first. The first thing I learned was Bourbon Street Parade in was it 6th grade, I think? Then I went on through middle school, high school, college. I went to the Frost School of Music at the University of Miami. Obviously a school that has a very strong contemporary lineage. Giaco taught there and Papathini taught there, and that's kind of the image that they've made and cultivated for themselves. Although obviously the curriculum is much more diverse and holistic than just that. But when I was right before COVID, turned the world upside down, I got together a group of my friends and peers from the Frost School of Music, and we flew back from Miami to Sacramento, California, which is where I'm from and where the Sacramento Jazz Education Foundation is based. And we brought a horn section from Frost, and we partnered with a group of local young musicians for a rhythm section to play at the Tea Garden Jazz Festival. And I got a lot out of that experience and kind of returning literally and also symbolically to my roots, in that a lot of these kind of conceptual performance techniques and objectives that is so stressed at kind of the highest levels of jazz education about the listening and the interaction between yourself and your fellow musicians, that is sort of lost through much of the beginning and the middle. You don't really get to that until you're talking about the more advanced improvisation classes. It doesn't get addressed. Is really the first things that I learned. And I've always felt that has made me stand out among my peers. And I have felt that the ability to do that, as well as to think in music in terms of making a melodic statement in addition to, not instead of, addressing the harmonic content of a song, has greatly benefited my playing and my career and my path through the music. And when I brought the group out, and they all had some level of experience in the music as well, the traditional jazz, I could hear all of us kind of understanding and collectively looking at the music through a different perspective than we were, doing commonly in school up until that point. So I think that traditional jazz is, you just simply can't understate the value of doing it early and often in music education.
Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan. That's great. So basically, what I'm hearing, and I heard this from some other people that I talked with in preparation for today, is that the accessibility of the harmonic and melodic structures in traditional jazz and the functions of the instruments in the ensemble, that translates very well into useful information that you can apply in a modern context. Because think about it, you're doing polyphonic improvisation. You're not playing the head and then everybody solos for 6 choruses. You're playing together. And every time you play, you're having to arrange the song on the fly. You need an understanding of what your instrument is supposed to be doing. You need a sufficient understanding of harmony so that you can respond appropriately to what the other people are doing. And I think that skill is useful in any jazz musical context, because you have to do that. I heard Jeff Hamilton yesterday talking about, the piano trio, the bass, the piano, the drums, They are listening to each other, adjusting what they're doing, responding to each other. That's a constant in traditional jazz. Happens all the time. It's no different from any other form of jazz. Sammy, I want to make sure that you get to speak. We're gonna change gears just a little bit because Sammy Miller is here. I just met him recently. Bruce Goldberg introduced us to each other online, and I asked him if he'd be willing to come and speak. And the reason for it was I was looking for people who have a more modern sensibility in the music that they're presenting, with roots that come from traditional jazz. And Sammy and I met and talked about that a little bit this morning. But if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit, he's very shy, so he's a reluctant performer. If you have not experienced his band, The Congregation, you want to. You're performing tomorrow night?
Yeah, tomorrow at 4.
Tomorrow night at 4 o'clock. I'll let him tell you all about it. This is Sammy Miller from New York.
Thank you so much. I'll be brief because I want to hear more of the music. I love the music. So I'm from Los Angeles. While I was studying at the Juilliard School, I became close with recently passed historian Phil Schaap. And it's interesting because the music I was connected to first was, like you mentioned, Jeff Hamilton. And what I liked about that music was, I was like, this is jazz music, but it's dance music. Like, that was as far as my brain could wrap around what music could be. And as I got to know Phil and he started playing me early music, King Oliver, as he started playing me the Chicago Gang guys, and he started playing me all sorts of music from an earlier generation, I started to really be attracted to both the way musicians, which to me, as a drummer, I don't want to play music that's about someone improvising. It's too focused on a single person. I grew up playing in rock bands with my family. My sister's a guitarist, and I always liked music that was about a group of people. And to Bill's point, as we've gone into the area of Jamie Ebersol's of working on practicing alone, you take a melody and then you take 37 to 808 courses of improvisation. I just try to think about, who are you thinking about? Like, are you alone, Picasso sitting in a room, or are you thinking about how it makes an audience feel? Are you thinking about how it makes the other musicians on stage feel? And so I was always really taken, as soon as I started hearing this kind of music, I was like, oh my gosh, this is like everybody is in this thing together. It's very familial. And so when I started my band, the music that the first arrangement we worked on was Mahogany Hall Stomp. And music like that, in its DNA, it's interactive, it's group oriented, it's also dance music, which is the thing I loved about Jeff Hamilton Trio. And so from there, then my brain just went wild as far as choosing repertoire and borrowing from that era of that era sensibility. I was connected to it, like the humor of it, the sort of like slapstick nature of some of that stuff, the performance nature, the buoyancy of life, the excitement for life, yet very serious musicianship. And it only works. That's the cool thing I love about trad jazz, is it doesn't work unless the music is like. So for me, with my ensemble, we borrow so much from that tradition, and that's the music that we're probably most impacted by, even though I spent a lot of time studying everything else. It just, I think I said to you this morning, but you can't abstract an abstraction. Like, I don't want to comment on a comment. You want to comment on, like, the original work. So that's the thing I'm interested in responding to. So that's what we're doing.
Fabulous. And I really encourage you to hear the band. They're absolutely amazing. The spirit and the commingling of human expression, how about that? Write that one down too. It's an amazing thing to watch. Now we're going to move into the theory of music being like food, which is that some people love Brussels sprouts and some people don't. You can't explain it. Responding to a type of music can't be explained. 2 quick stories about that. I did not play music at all until I was 16 years old. I didn't hear any music that excited me enough to actually get an instrument and learn how to play. In 1962, I did. I heard a song. Those of us with gray hair in the room will remember there was a song called Midnight in Moscow. Yeah, Kenny Ball and his Jazzmen, an English trad band. Blew my mind. And literally true. I had a friend in high school who played trombone, and I knew he had a trad band. It was called Dixieland Band. But I went to him and I said, what instrument don't you have in your band? He said, oh, we don't have a banjo. So I took the money I earned on my paper route for 5 years, and I bought a banjo and started to play at the age of 16. And at the age of 18, I started playing professionally. Nobody knew I had music in me until I heard something that excited it. Now, why do you like something? There's no explanation for that. I don't know why that music reached me in the way that it did, but it did. Other people heard that, and it was meaningless to them. And that obtains at all times. You cannot define why you like Brussels sprouts. I do. But I know there are people who hate them. I've heard, I love the polyphony of traditional jazz. I've had good friends who are good musicians who hear it as chaos. They like to hear a rhythm section with one horn. They like to hear one person play. They experience polyphony as chaos. So I wrote down earlier today that any artist who creates art of any type doesn't get to choose how people will react to it, nor can you necessarily predict how they're going to react to it. And so, if you make music with the intention that what you're playing, or what your solo is in a jazz context, if your intention is to communicate an emotion, you can't guarantee that it's going to elicit the emotion that you want. It's up to the audience to decide what it does for them. And there are people who go absolutely nuts listening to traditional jazz, just loving it. And there are people who just can't stand it. Same with modern jazz. I've often heard, I play mostly in the traditional jazz context. Dave does too. And people will often say things to me like, oh my God, that modern jazz just that means nothing to me. It's just a bunch of noise. It's just somebody playing as many notes as they possibly can. That's what it sounds like to them. So that's legitimate. That's how they feel. There's no explanation for it. There's no way to teach someone to like Brussels sprouts. Same with music. But I think that the teaching of traditional jazz is useful in jazz education in general. My experience of it has been that the schools or colleges where I have been, where jazz is being taught, traditional jazz gets pushed aside fairly early. It is acknowledged that it exists. You get to hear West End blues, you know, in your first day of class, and you might hear a little Sidney Bechet or some Jelly Roll Morton, but that very quickly gets set aside. And you move into Benny Goodman or Fletcher Henderson, swing era, and then that gets pushed aside. It's as though, as each style of jazz emerged, it was superseded by the next one and is no longer relevant. It just isn't true. It's all relevant. What was I thinking of here? Oh, I wanted to briefly talk about Shelley's daughter. She was a student at the New England Conservatory of Music, playing classical violin. She was quite a formidable musician. In her senior year, she went home to her apartment walking up the stairs, she heard some music that she had never heard before. She went to the door from which it was emanating, knocked on the door, the person answered, she said, "Where is that music from? Because I'm going to go there." It was Greek rebetiko music, a traditional form of Greek music that was popular in Greece in like the teens,
Pre-1922.
the 20s. When?
Pre-1922.
Pre-1922. It absolutely lit a fire in her. And she finished her curriculum. She got her BA in violin performance and immediately applied for and got a Fulbright scholarship to go to Greece and study that music. And she's now, 20 years later, she lives in Greece and she's a famous Greek violinist specializing in what would be trad Greek music. There's no explanation for that. Let's see. Bria Skonberg. You know Bria Skonberg?
Yes.
No? You should. She's a wonderful trumpeter, singer, composer. She lives in New York. She was at, she performed at the GEN conference 2 years ago or last year. I don't remember.
Pictures up on the con booth down there.
And she's in what?
The con, and the exhibit hall where the instruments are.
Oh,
She's one of the pictures up on.
she's a con artist. I knew that.
I should have reworded that.
She said some interesting things when I asked her about trad jazz, and I decided to quote some of it. She says trad jazz is the ground from which every style of jazz and popular music of the last century grew. It was the first American popular music, and everything else refers to it in some way. I think that's fair. She also said, "The joy and community I experienced as a youth playing trad encouraged me to pursue music professionally. Traditional jazz created a non-intimidating environment that young players, especially girls, need in order to have the confidence to take chances without fear of judgment." I took that as a compliment because she attended our jazz camp when she was a young teenager. And it's our purpose to create that environment where people can try and where they can fail without feeling like a failure, where they can do what they need to do in order to learn. And she felt that the traditional jazz environment is more likely to be less judgmental of you. I don't know that that's the case because I've never functioned in the more modern or bebop environment. I have sat in with modern bands and actually played banjo with them, which was a lot of fun. First, because it's unusual, and second, because it was just a kick to be able to extend the harmonies past what I usually get to do on the banjo. Anyway, the language of trad jazz is less complex than that of bebop or other modern forms, but it still provides you the opportunity to communicate something human, which is what art does. It communicates. You don't know to whom, but in general, if you ask people about traditional jazz music, you'll hear adjectives like fun, excitement, strong emotions. Anger's not usually one of them, but I've heard it. I've heard Wild Bill Davidson make some fairly angry statements. If you're not familiar with him, anyway, you should be.
Are we going to try to play some more music?
Yeah.
Say what?
Play some
Should we
music.
play some more music at some point?
Let's do, I'll tell you what. Yes, sir.
And when the talk first started, you asked why we had come here. When the talk first started, you asked why we had come here in the first place.
Yes.
And I didn't answer that, but now my answer would be because I love the music of Benny Carter. He plays my instrument. So maybe if I could hear some thoughts on that figure, I would love to. I don't know if I'm mistaken in considering his music traditional jazz.
Okay, I'm not,
Benny Carter.
I love Benny Carter, especially his trumpet playing.
Okay.
I really enjoyed that. I mentioned Wild Bill Davidson. One of the bands that is kind of a through line in the history of traditional jazz is Eddie Condon's band. They never stopped until Eddie passed away. But this is from 1952, and check out Wild Bill. Okay, we're going into the chorus of the song. I'm going to skip ahead because I want you to hear the out choruses, which in traditional jazz are generally the most exciting. I don't know how you feel about that, but that's exciting music, in my opinion. Sammy, are you aware of Cliff Lehman?
As a drummer?
Yeah. Oh, one of the greats.
I was gonna ask you what that was, the real suggestion.
Yeah, the players, there was Wild Bill Davidson, Edmund Hall was on clarinet, Cuddy Cutshaw, and I don't know his real first name. No, it's Bill. William Deweese Cutshaw was his name. Dave brought up something. Do you know which cut it is? We're going to hear Freddie Hubbard.
Freddie Hubbard,
Trad
Trad
Jazz.
Jazz. How about that? That's number 6.
This would be number 6 on your program.
It's from 1987. Curtis Fuller on trombone, the late Curtis Fuller. Kurt Lacey. Baptiste on clarinet, a modernist from New Orleans.
Can you play a segment of the trumpet solo from that?
Didn't bring it, we just,
Okay, I'm
he
just.
already stated right there, that's what I brought with me, with a predetermined.
I was really struck by how he changed his sound to sound like Lewis.
Mm.
That, I would have never identified that as Freddie Hubbard.
No, Freddie
I was
Hubbard.
curious what he did in his solo.
Yeah, he toured with that group, I think.
I've heard other more modern players. When I was living in San Diego, I booked trad jazz bands for gigs of all sorts, and there were some modern players in town that enjoyed playing those. And I like to think that either they came to the music on their own when they were young, or they were lucky enough to attend a school, a high school or college, where they had an instructor who exposed them to it. Back to my food analogy, if you don't taste something, you don't know whether you like it or not. And with music, you got to hear it, you got to try it, and with some familiarity, perhaps that helps you to understand. But anyone who plays the trumpet, I would almost defy you to find a modern trumpet player who's not aware of the music of Louis Armstrong.
Yes.
It's just not possible. And we're over time. And because we have a partisan.
Do we have anybody after us?
That's what I'm trying to find out right now. I'm scrolling through the schedule.
Got a couple more great examples I'd love to share.
What's that?
What's Cliff's last name?
Lehman,
Oh.
Leeman. Can we start something while he's checking? I want you to hear Trombone Shorty. In New Orleans, everything mashes together.
I think there's nothing in here after us.
Okay, so we'll go on a few more minutes.
They didn't tell me how to even shut down, so I'm not going to.
All right, let's squeeze in some Trombone Shorty. He is not, he plays trumpet and trombone. He's not generally a trad jazz guy, but anybody and everybody who comes up in New Orleans plays trad jazz at some point, because that's where it all started, and the music is big down there. It's a part of the fabric of everyday life. And this is an example of him playing trad jazz. I believe he's overdubbing trumpet and trombone here, and you've got an organ instead of a piano. So it's a very hip sound. It's number 7.
Number 7.
The tune is When My Dreamboat Comes Home, which is a New Orleans standard. That's a more modern approach, right? And that's very typical of what you hear in New Orleans these days. They're playing within a trad jazz context, but they're using later harmonic language and phrasing.
Okay, so I think we've made our case. We're in favor of traditional jazz for a lot of different reasons, and I think it's very clear that traditional jazz has not gone away. It's still around. I myself performed at Gen in Reno 2 years ago in a traditional jazz band. Wycliffe Gordon joined us on the trombone. It was very well received. People enjoyed it. trad jazz. And I think, just one final point, that if you're training musicians who are thinking about being professional jazz musicians, giving them some familiarity with how to play in the trad setting, in the trad repertoire, you're giving them an opportunity for more work. There are more gigs. New York, there are trad gigs in New York, New Orleans, San Francisco. There are still, in most major cities, there are gigs for people who can play trad jazz. There are people who do it. There's a whole range of ways to do it. You can play in the very old style, which some people really enjoy. I'm thinking here of Vince Giordano, for example, playing the hot music of the 20s, the dance music. That's very popular. And as Gordon Howe points out, if you're playing any kind of jazz, you're involved in 1.4% of the music that is consumed by Americans. So, just to keep it sufficiently humble, we're a niche market. And trad is a niche, and bebop is a niche. They're all the different styles are. And they're all valuable, and they all reinforce each other and are varieties of the same thing. And we think, if you're an educator, you're an educator. Bring some trad to your students. Let them.
Take one of these.
I'll tell you, I teach jazz history as well as combos and things, but in my jazz history class, I spend the largest chunk of time on early jazz and Louis Armstrong.
Thank you.
Because all of my students are familiar with bebop and beyond.
Yes.
That's how they come to me.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I make them fall in love with Louis Armstrong. It takes about 2.5 months. And we learn to sing Potato Head Blues, and it works. They fall in love with it. Great, you know. They don't get much chance to play it, unfortunately. I don't have that much time to incorporate that in my curriculum. But they're aware of it and recognize it and love it.
Excellent. We really appreciate that. Thank you so much. I want to thank my friend Dave Robinson. He's the guy who knows more about traditional jazz than anyone I know. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, sir.
Sammy Miller, thank you, and Duncan Mckelvin. And Jake, is that Jake?
Yeah.
I thought it was. Another graduate of our jazz camp program. He's playing in the playing tonight with the
Jazz Singers in 1 o'clock.
with the when is it?
7:45.
Yeah, the North Texas 1 o'clock band. Jake Millington, what a great player. Thank you for being here, and have a pleasant evening.
Can we play them some exit music?
Exit music.
Track number 8, just
Number
play.
8 is this is walkout music.
I'm not going to tell you what it is.
I know what that is.